The storm raged outside, hammering rain against the windows as Emma curled up in her favorite armchair, finally settling into the silence of her parents' remote farmhouse. They were away for the weekend, a rare trip for her father's work, leaving Emma to her own devices. She'd been looking forward to the solitude, a welcome change from the hustle and bustle of her daily life. The house had a history of strange noises, but tonight, everything felt more alive than usual. The familiar creaks and groans seemed more pronounced, every tiny sound amplified against the oppressive quiet. She brushed it off, trying to focus on the movie she'd queued up. But her eyes kept darting to the darkened windows, to the closed doorways in every room she entered, as though something might be watching her. An hour passed, then another, and Emma felt herself finally relaxing, slipping into the story on screen. That's when she heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps, outside the window nearest her chair. She paused the movie, staring toward the glass, but all she could see was her own reflection in the dim light. Straining her ears, she heard the faint rustling again, closer now. Brushing it off as her imagination, she tried to laugh it off, switching on another light to banish the shadows. But the noise continued, steady, almost like someone or something was circling the house. Her mind raced, considering the possibility of animals outside, but her heart quickened with fear at the thought of a stranger in the yard. She told herself it was nothing, and returned to the couch. As she settled back down, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Enjoying your night, Emma?" Her heart froze. She hadn't told anyone she'd be alone tonight, hadn't posted anything on social media about her parents' absence. Her fingers trembled as she dialed her mom's number, praying she'd pick up. But after 2 rings, the call dropped, leaving her staring at her screen in dismay. Her Wi-Fi and data were strong. There was no reason for the call to fail. Determined to shake off the fear, she forced herself to breathe slowly. Maybe it was a prank, she reasoned. Someone from school, bored on a rainy night. But the dread inside her only grew as she tried to calm down. Suddenly, there was another message. "Do you know who's in the house with you?" She felt her stomach turn, icy terror flooding her veins. She knew every inch of the house, every possible hiding spot. Nobody was here. She'd checked every room after her parents left, locking the doors, making sure the windows were sealed. And yet, the message sent a chill straight through her. The minutes dragged by in tense silence, each one stretched thin by the fear of what might be lurking around her. She knew she should call the police, but somehow she couldn't bring herself to move, paralyzed by the thought of alerting whoever might be out there. She was frozen, staring at the phone, waiting for another message. After what felt like hours, the stillness shattered with the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor in the room directly above her. Her pulse raced as she looked up, feeling her chest tighten as if she could barely breathe. The room above was her parents' bedroom. Nobody should have been there, yet she distinctly heard movement. Slowly, she grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it tightly as she crept up the stairs, the silence broken only by the faint drip of water from the rain-soaked roof. As she reached the landing, another scrape sounded from behind the closed door to her parents' room, louder and more deliberate. She took a shaky breath, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. Twisting it open, she peered inside, her eyes scanning the darkened room. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but the air felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't describe. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. That's when she saw it, the faint outline of a figure crouched by her father's closet. They were almost impossible to see, pressed into the shadows, but the shape was unmistakable. The figure slowly turned its head toward her, and even in the darkness, she could make out a wide, grotesque grin stretched across their face. The intruder's eyes gleamed with a sick kind of amusement, and Emma felt rooted to the spot, unable to scream or even look away. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, every instinct in her body screaming to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, they spoke. "You're all alone, Emma. Just you and me." The words sent a bolt of terror through her, finally breaking her paralysis. She bolted from the room, sprinting down the stairs, her only thought to get out of the house. But as she reached the front door, she found it locked, the bolt jammed tight. Frantic, she tried the back door, only to discover it was also locked from the outside. Panic rising, she glanced around for an escape, for something she could use to defend herself. Her phone buzzed again, and against her better judgment, she glanced down. "Running won't help. Emma, I'll always find you." In her desperation, she decided to break a window, grabbing a heavy vase and hurling it against the glass. The sound shattered the silence, but she didn't care, shoving her hand through the opening and scrambling outside into the storm. Cold rain pelted her face as she stumbled through the mud, heart racing as she sprinted toward the nearby woods, hoping to hide until the intruder gave up. She heard footsteps behind her, following in the darkness, never far enough away to give her any relief. She tripped, catching herself before she fell, her breath ragged and her vision blurred by the rain. She darted behind a tree, pressing her back against the rough bark, willing herself to be silent. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, pausing mere feet from her hiding spot. She dared not breathe, barely daring to peek around the tree trunk. In the shadows, she could make out the figure, scanning the woods, their grin fixed, eyes glowing with something dark and hungry. Emma held her breath, praying they wouldn't hear her pounding heart. But they just stood there, unmoving, as if they could sense her nearby. Then, in a soft, mocking whisper, they called out, "Home, sweet home, Emma, come on out!" She bolted, no longer caring if they heard her, her mind racing with fear as she fled deeper into the woods, the rain blurring her vision and the branches clawing at her as she ran. She didn't stop until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor, the muddy earth cold and unyielding beneath her. For hours she waited, trembling in the darkness, hoping the figure had given up. But even as dawn broke, casting weak light through the trees, she didn't dare return to the house. It wasn't until she heard a distant voice, her mother's voice calling her name, that she staggered out of the woods, collapsing into her mother's arms, sobbing. Later, the police searched the house, combing through every room, but they found no sign of the intruder. No muddy footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to prove that anyone had been there at all. The messages on her phone had vanished, as if they'd never existed. Emma knew what she'd seen, what she'd heard, and she knew that somewhere out there, someone was waiting, watching. One stormy night, Kyle found himself alone in his apartment, a small place on the edge of town that he had only recently moved into. He liked the solitude, the peace that came from knowing his neighbors were a fair distance away. But that night, something felt off, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being watched. The night was silent, except for the rain pattering against the windows and the occasional creak of the old building settling. He tried to ignore the uneasiness, distracting himself with a book and the soft background music playing on his phone. That's when he heard it, a faint knock, barely audible, coming from his front door. Curious but slightly unnerved, he got up and peered through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe someone lost in the storm. But there was no one there. He shrugged, chalking it up to the wind or an animal, and returned to his chair. But just as he settled back down, the knocking returned, louder this time. Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He glanced toward the door, which was dead-bolted securely, and felt a chill as he heard the faint sound of scratching now, just below the door's lock. The sound of something sharp, like fingernails or claws, scraping at the wood. He held his breath, waiting, his mind racing. Maybe a raccoon or stray cat had wandered up to his doorstep, he told himself. But as he strained to listen, he heard something that shattered his sense of calm completely. A low, raspy whisper coming from the other side of the door. "Kyle, I know you're there." He froze, his skin prickling with fear. His name, his own name, spoken in a voice that was thin, broken, and sickly sweet. It sounded almost amused, as though it took pleasure in his terror. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Kyle yelled, "Who's out there?" Silence followed, thick and tense, as he stood motionless, waiting for any response. But there was nothing. Minutes passed, and eventually he convinced himself it must have been a prank. He checked the peephole again, finding only the empty, darkened hallway outside his door. As the hours slipped by, Kyle tried to sleep, but his mind refused to settle. Every creak, every faint noise seemed amplified, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He tossed and turned, his exhaustion growing, until finally he drifted off. Sometime around 3 a.m, he woke with a start. The room was pitch black, save for a faint glow from his phone on the nightstand. Disoriented, he rubbed his eyes, unsure of what had woken him. That's when he heard it again. A light, persistent tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. The sound was closer, much closer. It was coming from his closet. His heart pounded as he stared at the closet door, which was slightly ajar, again a sliver of darkness barely visible in the shadows. He held his breath, listening as the tapping continued, rhythmic and patient, as though whatever was inside knew he was listening. With a shudder, he reached for his phone, intending to call someone, anyone, for help. But as he unlocked it, he saw a new notification. An unknown number had sent him a text message. With trembling hands, he opened it. "You can't hide, Kyle. I'm inside." The words made his blood run cold, and his grip tightened on the phone as he backed away from the closet. His mind raced with panic, unsure if he should flee the apartment or stay and confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. He decided to run, not daring to look back as he stumbled toward the door. But as he reached for the doorknob, he felt a strange, icy coldness grip his wrist. Slowly, he looked down and gasped in horror. Thin, skeletal fingers wrapped around his wrist, each digit so bony and pale it seemed to shimmer in the darkness. He yanked his hand away, stumbling backward as the closet door creaked open further, revealing a dark figure standing inside, its face obscured in shadow. Kyle's throat went dry as the figure slowly stepped forward, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace, its movements almost predatory. The air around him grew colder with each step the figure took, and the smell of damp earth and rotting wood filled the room. The figure stopped just a few feet away, close enough for Kyle to see its face. It was a grotesque, distorted mask of human features, sunken eyes, skin stretched too tightly across the skull, and a wide, lipless grin that revealed rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. It stared at him, unblinking, its eyes gleaming with a cruel intelligence. Kyle's mind screamed at him to move, to scream, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. He felt paralyzed, trapped in the figure's gaze, as it slowly raised one bony finger to its lips. "Shh," it whispered, that same raspy voice he had heard earlier, filled with mockery. "Don't be afraid. I've been watching you for so long, waiting for you to notice." It reached out, its hand brushing his cheek, leaving a trail of icy numbness in its wake. He felt himself slipping away, his vision dimming, as though the figure were drawing the very life out of him. Just before everything went black, he heard it whisper one last time, "You're mine now, Kyle. No one's coming to help you." When morning came, the building manager found Kyle's door wide open, his apartment empty. His belongings were untouched, his bed neatly made, and his phone left on the nightstand, displaying a single chilling message. "Thank you for letting me in." Sophie had always been a light sleeper, especially when her husband, Mark, was away on business trips. Their home was secluded, surrounded by dense woods that were peaceful during the day but unsettling at night. She had lived there for years, and though the house creaked and groaned like any old place, it was usually easy for her to ignore. But this night felt different. It started with a low humming sound, so faint she thought she'd imagined it. She lay in bed, straining to hear as the hum turned into a soft, irregular tapping, as though someone or something was gently knocking against the windows downstairs. Sophie tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was the wind or branches brushing against the house. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, moving from one window to the next, as though something was circling the house, looking for a way inside. Taking a deep breath, Sophie reached for her phone to call Mark, even though she knew he wouldn't be able to do anything from so far away. She just needed to hear his voice. But when she unlocked the screen, her stomach twisted in fear. Her camera app was open, and a new photo sat in her gallery. Heart pounding, she opened it. The photo was dark, blurry, but it was clearly of her, taken from just outside her bedroom window. She could see herself lying in bed, eyes wide with terror. Sophie froze, her mind racing. She'd checked every door and window before going to bed, made sure everything was locked. Whoever had taken that picture had somehow gotten close enough to her window to see her, but the only way onto that ledge was from the roof. For a long time, she lay still, afraid that even the slightest movement would alert whoever was outside that she'd seen the picture. Finally, she decided to call the police. But when she started to dial, her screen went black. Her phone had died, though she was sure it had been fully charged only an hour before. Trying to keep calm, she moved toward the bedroom door, intending to sneak downstairs to find the backup phone charger she kept in the living room. But as she reached for the doorknob, she heard a quiet, metallic scraping sound from the other side of the door, as if someone were dragging a key along its surface. Her heart pounded. as she backed away, the sound of scratching growing louder, more frantic, like whoever or whatever was outside couldn't wait any longer. Suddenly, the noise stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. She stood, barely daring to breathe, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Cautiously, she leaned toward the door, pressing her ear against it to listen. She didn't hear anything at first, only her own rapid heartbeat. But then from the other side of the wood, she heard a voice whispering, low and raspy, almost as if it were speaking directly into her ear. "Let me in, Sophie." The voice was barely more than a hiss, chilling in its familiarity. It sounded like her husband, Mark, but distorted, stretched, like someone imitating him. The tone was off, the warmth replaced by something cold and sinister. Panicked, Sophie took another step back, her mind racing. This wasn't possible. Mark was miles away, staying at a hotel in another city. She forced herself to move, bolting toward the window. She fumbled with the latch, desperate to escape, but just as she pushed it open, she heard the voice again, now filled with eerie amusement. "Where do you think you're going, Sophie?" She whipped around, only to find her bedroom empty. The door was still shut, the scratching and tapping gone, but the sense of dread filled the room, thick and oppressive. Trembling, she closed the window and backed into a corner, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting, watching. Then, her phone screen lit up. A single message from Mark. "I'll be home soon. Can you unlock the door for me?" Confused and terrified, Sophie stared at the message. She tried to convince herself it was really him, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Her husband never texted like that. He always said goodbye or sent an emoji, anything that added warmth. This message felt clinical, like a stranger's attempt at imitation. Just then, her phone buzzed with a photo message. Dreading what she might see, she opened it. It was another photo of her bedroom, this time from the corner by the door, as though someone had been standing there, watching her moments earlier. In the picture, she could see herself, back against the wall, eyes wide with terror. Her own reflection stared back at her, but the face didn't look quite right. The expression was off, the features slightly distorted. And then, the lights went out. Plunged into darkness, Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She backed further into the corner, feeling trapped, knowing that if she moved, if she made a sound, whatever was outside or inside would find her. She didn't know how long she stood there, paralyzed by fear, when she heard a key turning in the front door, locked downstairs. She thought about hiding, about throwing herself under the bed or climbing out the window, but her body refused to move, her feet rooted to the spot. Moments later, she heard footsteps echoing up the stairs, slow, deliberate, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through her. She knew those footsteps. They were Mark's. But something about them felt wrong, mechanical, as though each step were taken with calculated precision, almost as if whoever was walking was mimicking the way her husband moved. Finally, the footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. There was a long pause, a silence so heavy she could barely breathe. And then she heard the door handle turn, slowly, the sound of it clicking as the door opened. In the darkness, she could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing in the doorway. Her husband's shape, his height, his build, but with a stillness that sent chills down her spine. The figure just stood there, unmoving, watching her in the dark. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then in that same familiar voice, distorted and wrong, it spoke. "I told you, Sophie. I'm home." The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and unnatural, almost like it was wearing a mask of her husband's skin. She could see it more clearly now, its face twisted, warped, as though it were trying to hold itself together but failing. The smile was too wide, the eyes too blank, and the skin seemed to stretch and ripple, like something struggling to fit into a human form. It took another step, and then another, until it was only a few feet away, staring at her with that horrifying, twisted grin. With the last ounce of strength she had, Sophie backed into the wall, her voice finally breaking free in a scream that tore through the silence. When the neighbors called the police, they found the house undisturbed, every door and window locked from the inside. The bedroom was empty, and Sophie was gone, her phone left on the bed, the last message still visible on the screen. "I'm here, Sophie. I'll always be here." And though they searched for days, she was never found. Only a single clue remained, a handprint smeared in blood on the bedroom wall, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. On the outskirts of town, there was an old Victorian house, abandoned for years and swallowed by thick trees that blocked out the sun. Everyone in town called it the Hollow House, a place haunted by dark rumors and strange happenings. But to 14-year-old Josh and his friends, it was just a creepy place to explore, until the night they decided to go inside. It was a dare, one meant to prove they weren't scared of anything, even the Hollow House. They snuck out under the cover of night, flashlight beams bouncing off the crooked fence posts as they made their way to the front steps. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting wood, and the house loomed over them, silent and ominous. As they stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under their weight, and dust swirled up in clouds, catching the thin beams of moonlight that slipped through cracked windows. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Josh led the way, gripping his flashlight tightly as they made their way down the hallway, past rooms filled with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. They explored room after room, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. Strange shadows seemed to dance along the walls, and the silence felt as though it was pressing down on them, thick and almost suffocating. Just as they were about to turn back, Josh noticed a door at the end of the hallway that looked different. Smaller, almost hidden. It was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Let's check it out," he whispered, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into what seemed to be a basement. A chill ran through him as he took the first step down, his friends following reluctantly behind. The air grew colder with each step, and an odd, sour smell drifted up from below. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, cramped basement with walls covered in old, yellowed wallpaper. The only light was from their flashlights, casting eerie shadows that made the room seem to pulse and shift. But as Josh swept his flashlight across the walls, he noticed something strange: scratch marks, deep and jagged, crisscrossing the walls as though someone had clawed at them in desperation. A sudden creak echoed through the room, and they all froze. Flashlights aimed wildly in every direction. Josh's heart hammered in his chest, and he tried to convince himself it was just the house settling, or maybe a rat scurrying in the darkness. But then they heard it, a faint, shuffling sound coming from the far corner of the room. One of Josh's friends, Max, whispered, "Let's go back. This place is messed up." But before they could turn to leave, the shuffling grew louder, closer, until they could see a dark shape moving in the shadows. As the shape came into view, Josh felt his stomach drop. It was a person, or what looked like a person, but horribly wrong. Their skin was pale and stretched thin, bones jutting out in unnatural angles. The figure's mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing rows of cracked and blackened teeth, and its eyes were wide, filled with a hunger that sent a shiver down Josh's spine. The figure crawled toward them, moving with unnatural speed, its joints cracking with each movement. Panicked, Josh turned to run, but the basement door had slammed shut, trapping them inside. His friends screamed, scrambling against the door, pounding on it with their fists, but it wouldn't budge. Josh looked back, watching in horror as the figure got closer, its bony fingers outstretched, reaching for them. In the flickering light of their flashlights, he could see something written on the walls in what looked like blood, scratched words over and over. "Don't look at it. Don't look at it." He felt his throat tighten with fear as he realized what it meant, but it was too late. His flashlight beam caught the figure's gaze, and he found himself staring directly into its eyes. They were bottomless pits, black and hollow, as though they sucked in all the light around them. He felt himself freeze, paralyzed by those eyes, unable to tear his gaze away no matter how much he wanted to. A feeling of overwhelming despair flooded over him, filling his mind with dark, twisted images, visions of death, of pain, of endless darkness that stretched on forever. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure reached out, its cold, bony fingers brushing his face, and he felt a sharp, burning pain in his chest, as though it were pulling the very life out of him. His vision blurred, and he saw his friends standing there, screaming, but they looked like they were fading away, growing distant, like he was sinking into a dark, endless void. The figure's voice was barely a whisper, echoing in his mind. "Stay with me. Forever." Just as he felt himself slipping away, one of his friends grabbed his arm, yanking him backward. He stumbled, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he broke eye contact with the figure. The door had somehow swung open, and without thinking, they all bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. They ran through the house, stumbling over broken furniture and barely pausing to catch their breath. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for air, their hearts pounding as they looked at the house. The windows were dark, silent, as though nothing had happened, as though no one had ever been inside. But as they caught their breath, they noticed something chilling. On the ground, just a few feet from the front steps, they found deep, fresh scratches in the dirt, long, jagged marks that led away from the house, disappearing into the woods. It looked as though someone had been dragged out of the house, clawing desperately at the ground. One by one, they turned to Josh, who was staring at his hands with a haunted look. There, in the faint moonlight, they could see scratches on his wrists and dirt under his fingernails, as though he'd been clawing at something in his sleep. In the days that followed, Josh couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking in every shadow, waiting for him to close his eyes. At night, he heard faint whispers, a voice calling his name, telling him to come back to the hollow house. And one night, weeks later, he vanished from his bed. His window was wide open, muddy footprints trailing across the floor. His family searched everywhere, but no one ever found him. But sometimes, on stormy nights, people passing by the hollow house swear they can hear whispers drifting through the air. And if you look closely, you might just see a pale face in the upstairs window, staring out with hollow eyes, waiting for the next person to enter. Lily lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of an old building downtown. She liked the independence, the quiet evenings to herself, and the city lights outside her window. But one night she started to hear a strange, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps moving slowly from one end of her apartment to the other. At first, she brushed it off. Old buildings made noise, she told herself. But over the next few nights, the footsteps returned, louder and more deliberate. They always started around midnight, and they grew closer and closer until she could swear they stopped just outside her bedroom door. On the 5th night, she lay in bed, her heart racing as she listened to the heavy, measured steps growing closer. They stopped right outside her door. She held her breath, gripping the edge of her blanket, waiting for something, anything to happen. Just as she began to relax, she heard a low, almost inaudible whisper. "Lily, let me in." Her blood ran cold. She lay perfectly still, convinced she was hearing things, but the whisper came again, soft but urgent, as though the speaker were pressing their mouth right against the door. "Lily, I know you're awake." She felt a chill creep down her spine. Her heart pounded as she stared at her bedroom door, half expecting it to open. But the whisper faded, and after a few long, agonizing minutes, the footsteps retreated down the hall, leaving her in silence. The next morning, she convinced herself it was all just a vivid dream, a trick of her mind. But as she stepped into the hallway, her blood ran cold. Thin, muddy footprints trailed from her front door down the hallway toward her bedroom, each print the size of a small bare foot, leading straight to her door and stopping there. That night she didn't sleep. She sat up in bed, clutching her phone, ready to call for help if the footsteps returned. Midnight came and went, and she finally began to feel foolish, her eyes growing heavy as she drifted into a light sleep. Around 2 a.m., her phone vibrated on the nightstand, jarring her awake. She picked it up, squinting at the screen. It was a text message from her own number. "Let me in, Lily, I'm so cold." She dropped the phone in horror, her hands shaking as she stared at the message. She wanted to scream, to run, but she felt trapped, too afraid to move. A chill settled over the room, and she heard it again, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through her apartment. They moved closer, pausing outside her door once again. She could hear the faint sound of someone breathing, raspy and uneven, like they were struggling for air. The doorknob rattled gently, as though someone were testing it, waiting for her to unlock it. "Please, Lily," the voice whispered, hoarse and pleading. "I'm so cold. Let me in." Unable to take it anymore, she scrambled out of bed, throwing herself against the door, pressing her weight against it as if she could somehow keep whatever was outside from coming in. She heard the faintest laugh, a sound so chilling and hollow it made her skin crawl. And then, slowly, the footsteps retreated, fading into the silence. For the rest of the night, she sat with her back against the door, too terrified to sleep. When morning came, she was exhausted, but determined to find some kind of answer. She went to her landlord asking if he knew anything about the building's history, hoping for a logical explanation. The landlord looked uncomfortable, glancing around before lowering his voice. Well, there's an old story about a girl named Emily. She lived here years ago in your very apartment. She was different, you could say, always talking about the cold, asking people to keep her warm. She was found one winter right outside her own door. They say she froze to death, locked out of her own apartment. No one knows how she got out there. But he hesitated, eyeing Lily with an odd look. Some tenants say she never really left. Lily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. That night, she barricaded herself in her room, convinced it was all just a creepy story designed to scare new tenants. But as the hours passed and midnight approached, her fear grew, a gnawing dread that left her trembling. And then, at exactly 12:01, the footsteps began. They were louder this time, heavier, as though someone were dragging themselves across the floor. She sat in bed, frozen in fear, as the steps stopped outside her door. The doorknob jiggled, harder this time, as though someone were trying to break in. "Lily, please, let me in." The voice was louder, more desperate, the whisper now a soft, pleading moan. She felt tears prick at her eyes, her body trembling as she pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound. But it only grew louder, the whisper turning into a mournful wail that echoed through her apartment, filling the room with a bone-chilling cold. "Let me in, Lily. I'm so cold, so cold." Suddenly, she felt a sharp, icy pressure on her shoulder, as though a freezing hand had clamped down on her, squeezing hard. She cried out, scrambling away from the door, feeling the cold follow her, wrapping around her like a shroud. In a final act of desperation, she screamed, "Leave me alone." The cold lifted, the room falling silent. She sat there, gasping for breath, her heart racing as the silence settled over her once more. But just as she began to calm down, she heard a faint sound, a single soft breath, right next to her ear. "Don't you want to keep me warm, Lily?" The next morning, her friends found her apartment door wide open. Inside, there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else having been there. But in the bedroom, they found Lily lying in bed, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. She was ice cold, as though every ounce of warmth had been drained from her body. And on her phone, sitting on the nightstand, there was a single unread message. "Thank you for letting me in." It was well after midnight, and Sam was home alone, sitting on the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone when he heard a soft knock at the front door. He froze, his eyes darting to the hallway. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the streets outside were usually silent at this hour. The knock came again, louder this time. Sam's heart pounded as he moved cautiously to the door. He peered through the peephole, but saw nothing, only the empty porch and darkness beyond. Convinced it was just the wind or maybe a prank, he started to turn away when he heard it, a faint voice calling from the other side. "Sam, let me in." A chill ran down his spine. How did they know his name? He looked through the peephole again, but saw only the empty porch and the distant street lamp casting eerie shadows. "Sam," the voice whispered again, more insistent now. "It's cold out here. Let me in." He stepped back, his heart pounding, but before he could decide what to do, his phone buzzed in his hand. The notification showed an unread text from an unknown number. "Please, Sam, let me in." Panic seized him. He typed a quick reply, his hands shaking. "Who is this? What do you want?" Seconds later, his phone buzzed again. The response was almost immediate. "You invited me here, Sam. Remember?" Sam stared at the message, his mind racing. He hadn't invited anyone over. This had to be a prank, he told himself, but something about the situation felt wrong. He forced himself to turn away, trying to ignore the strange urge to open the door. But as he moved back to the couch, he heard something from behind him. It was a quiet, shuffling sound, like someone was dragging their feet across the porch. He tried to ignore it, but the footsteps grew louder, moving closer to the door, stopping just on the other side. And then the knocking returned. Only now it was frantic, as if whoever or whatever was out there was desperate to get inside. "Sam, please, let me in." His phone buzzed again, and he reluctantly looked down. "You have to open the door, Sam. I'm here. Don't you remember?" He couldn't take it anymore. Trembling, he typed back, "Remember what? I don't know who you are." The The response came instantly. "You promised me." Sam's mind flashed back to a night weeks ago when he and his friends had been messing around with a Ouija board. It was a stupid dare, a joke they'd all laughed about. But toward the end, the board had spelled out a single cryptic message. "I'll be seeing you, Sam." He'd thought it was just his friends playing a prank, but now, standing in his dark living room with a voice whispering his name from the other side of the door, he wasn't so sure. He tried to calm himself, telling himself it was all a coincidence. But just as he started to turn away, he heard a creaking sound from down the hall, one of the windows sliding open. His stomach dropped as he realized he hadn't locked it. Swallowing hard, he crept toward the hallway, his heart thudding in his chest. When he reached the end, he saw the window hanging open, curtains fluttering in the cold breeze. He reached out to close it, but then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and they were coming from inside the house. He froze, barely daring to breathe, as he heard the steps growing closer, moving steadily down the hallway toward him. The air turned frigid, the room filling with an overwhelming sense of dread as the footsteps stopped just out of sight around the corner. A low whisper echoed through the hall. "You invited me in, Sam. You said I could stay." He took a step back, then another, but as he turned to run, he was stopped by the sight of a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a person. At least, it looked like one, but its features were all wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were wide, hollow, and fixed on him with a gaze that seemed to bore straight into his soul. The figure smiled, but the smile was too wide, stretching across its face in a way that felt alien, inhuman. "Don't you remember?" it whispered, stepping closer. "You promised me." Sam stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to run, but his legs felt like lead. He watched, paralyzed, as the figure moved closer, its hollow eyes never leaving his. Desperate, he raised his phone, snapping a picture in the faint hope that he might somehow prove this was real. But as the flash lit up the hallway, the figure vanished, leaving only an empty corridor. His phone buzzed. Heart pounding, he looked down to see a new message, this one containing a photo. It was a picture of his own hallway, taken from his phone just seconds ago. Only now, in the picture, the figure was right behind him, smiling that awful, too-wide smile. Before he could react, his phone went dark. The lights in the hallway flickered, and he felt a cold breath against his neck. "Thank you for letting me in, Sam," the voice whispered. The lights went out completely, and the house fell into darkness. The next day, Sam's friends came looking for him, concerned after he hadn't shown up to work and hadn't answered any calls. They found his apartment door slightly ajar, the inside eerily quiet. The place looked undisturbed, except for Sam's phone lying on the floor in the hallway. His friends picked it up, noticing a single unread message, "I'm home now." And though they searched everywhere, Sam was never seen again. But sometimes, late at night, people passing by his apartment claim they can hear a faint knock at the door and a whisper from inside the darkened rooms. "I'm home, Sam. Aren't you going to let me in?" One chilly autumn night, Emily was house-sitting for her aunt, who lived on the edge of a remote forest. The house was quiet, with only the occasional creak as the wind brushed against the old wooden frame. Emily had always found the house a little unsettling with its long hallways, dimly lit rooms, and walls that seemed to whisper with every breeze. But tonight felt different, like the silence was alive, heavy with something she couldn't quite place. Around midnight, as she was about to go to bed, Emily heard a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere in the house. She froze, listening. It was a steady rhythmic sound, like someone gently tapping their fingernails against a wooden surface. She brushed it off as a pipe or maybe a branch brushing against the window, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Reluctantly, she followed the sound down the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the creaky floorboards. She stopped outside the guest room, where the tapping seemed loudest, and slowly opened the door. The room was empty, just as she'd left it, and the noise stopped the moment she stepped inside. She glanced around, heart racing, but saw nothing unusual. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Trying to calm her nerves, Emily closed the door and went back to her room. But just as she settled under the covers, the tapping resumed, this time louder, echoing from the floor beneath her bed. She lay perfectly still, her breath shallow as the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone tapping their nails against the wood in a slow, taunting rhythm. Summoning every bit of courage, she slowly leaned over the side of the bed, flashlight in hand, and peeked underneath. There was nothing there. The empty space stared back at her, dust bunnies gathering in the corners, untouched. She felt a wave of relief, laughing softly at her own paranoia, and climbed back into bed, convinced she was just spooking herself. But then her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up, noticing an unread message from an unknown number. "I'm in the closet." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her mind racing. The tapping had stopped, and the silence felt heavy, suffocating. She glanced toward the closet door across the room. It was closed, just as it had been when she'd come into the room, but now it felt ominous, like it was watching her. With trembling hands, she typed back, "Who is this? Stop messing with me." There was no reply. She kept her eyes glued to the closet door, her hand hovering over her phone, ready to call someone, anyone, for help. But just as she worked up the courage to move, her phone buzzed again. "Come closer. Open the door." Her throat tightened, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. She wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but she couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. She sat in silence, watching the closet door, feeling like the air itself was pressing down on her, like something was holding its breath, waiting. A third message came through. This one even more chilling. "I can see you, Emily." Her skin prickled with horror, and a chill ran through her body. She hadn't told anyone she was staying here. She didn't know who could possibly be watching her, and that thought alone sent her mind spinning. Then, slowly, the closet door began to creak open. Just an inch, but enough for her to see the darkness inside. A pitch-black void that seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing the dim light of her room. Emily wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her eyes were locked on the closet as a shape began to emerge, spilling a dark silhouette with impossibly long, thin fingers that stretched out, curling around the edge of the door. It moved slowly, inching forward, a shadow that didn't seem fully human. Panicking, she grabbed her phone and dialed her aunt's number, desperate for someone to tell her she was safe, that this was all in her head. The phone rang once, twice, and finally her aunt picked up. "Aunt Claire?" Emily's voice was shaking, barely a whisper. "There's something, in the closet. I don't know what to do." Her aunt's voice came through the line, calm but unnervingly flat. "Emily, what are you talking about? There's nothing in that closet." I can see it," Emily stammered. Her eyes still locked on the dark figure as it slithered further into the room. Its eyes just visible now, 2 pinpricks of cold, dead light fixed on her. Her aunt paused, then whispered, "Emily, you shouldn't be able to see it. Close your eyes. Whatever you do, don't look." Emily's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" "It's already seen you," her aunt replied, her voice almost apologetic. "But if you don't look, maybe it won't be able to find you." The figure was closer now, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring each step. Emily clenched her eyes shut, trembling, listening to the quiet, dragging steps as they moved closer and closer. But then, just inches from her bed, the footsteps stopped. She felt an overwhelming presence looming over her, filling the air with a suffocating chill. In a voice so close it felt like it was breathing into her ear, it whispered, "Look at me, Emily." Her heart pounded, every instinct screaming at her to keep her eyes shut, to ignore the voice. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Open your eyes, Emily. I want you to see me." Summoning every ounce of willpower, she clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay still, to keep her eyes shut, even as the voice continued, growing angrier, its tone shifting to a low, guttural snarl. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the presence seemed to retreat, the air slowly losing its icy chill. Emily lay there, her eyes still shut, until the room fell into an uneasy silence. Hours passed before she dared to open her eyes again. When she did, the room was empty. The closet door closed. She took a shaky breath, feeling a surge of relief, until she noticed her phone lying on the bed beside her. The screen lit up with one final message from the unknown number. "You looked." Emily's scream echoed through the house, but by the time the neighbors arrived, the room was empty. There was no sign of Emily, just her phone lying on the bed, still displaying that last haunting message. And on some nights, if you stand outside the house just after midnight, you might catch a glimpse of her, standing in the window, staring down with hollow, haunted eyes. And if you look closely, if you dare to look long enough, you might see something else behind her, a tall, dark figure with eyes like 2 pinpricks of light, watching. Jacob was a night owl, and on quiet nights, he'd often stay up in his living room, watching late-night TV or reading. His apartment was on the 13th floor of a tall, mostly empty building, and he liked the silence that came with it. He had no neighbors on his floor, so he rarely heard a sound from anyone else in the building. But one October night, that eerie silence was broken by a soft, echoing knock at his door. He glanced up from his book, puzzled. It was almost 2 a.m., too late for visitors, and he hadn't buzzed anyone up. He waited, listening, wondering if he'd imagined it. But a second knock followed, a little louder this time. He got up and peered through the peephole, expecting to see an empty hallway. But someone was standing there, a woman with her back to the door. She had long, dark hair that fell over her shoulders, and her head was tilted down, her body still as a statue. "Can I help you?" Jacob called through the door, unsure if she'd even hear him. She didn't respond, didn't turn around. She just stood there, motionless, her head bowed as if she were asleep. Feeling uneasy, Jacob decided not to open the door. Instead, he called building security, telling them someone was outside his apartment acting strangely. The guard assured him they'd be there in a few minutes to check it out. After hanging up, Jacob pressed his eye back to the peephole. But the woman was gone. He scanned the hallway as best as he could, but there was no trace of her. No footsteps, no sound of an elevator, just emptiness. Relieved, he assumed she'd left. But as he turned back toward the living room, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, surprised to see an unknown number calling him. He hesitated but answered, figuring it was the security guard calling to follow up. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, a heavy, static-filled silence that stretched on uncomfortably. "Hello?" he repeated, louder this time. Then, just as he was about to hang up, he heard a soft, raspy whisper on the line. "Why didn't you let me in?" Jacob froze, his heart pounding. He glanced back at the door, half expecting to see the woman standing there again, but everything was quiet. He hung up quickly, trying to shake off the strange feeling that crept over him. The minutes dragged on, and finally, the security guard knocked on his door, telling him the floor was clear, with no one wandering around. Jacob thanked him and locked the door, feeling foolish for being so spooked. But later, as he settled back into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence in his apartment felt different, thicker, like someone was there, just out of sight, watching him. As he lay there, trying to sleep, he heard it again, the soft, rhythmic knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside his closet. He sat up, staring at the closet door across the room. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as though someone were gently tapping from the other side. He swallowed, feeling his mouth go dry, and got out of bed, inching toward the closet, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The knocking stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open just a crack, revealing only darkness. His phone buzzed on his nightstand, the screen lighting up with a message from that same unknown number. "I'm here now, Jacob." He backed away, his hands shaking, and closed the closet door, locking it tight. But just as he turned to leave the room, he heard something, a faint, chilling whisper from the other side of the door. "Let me out, Jacob. You invited me in." Panicking, he ran to his living room, grabbing his keys and heading straight out of the apartment. He went down to the lobby, where he found the night guard. He tried to explain, stumbling over his words, but the guard just looked at him, confused. "Sir, there's no one in your apartment," the guard said. "No one else even has access to your floor right now." But Jacob refused to go back. Instead, he called a friend, asking to crash at their place for the night, too shaken to stay alone. His friend agreed, and Jacob spent the night on their couch, trying to convince himself that it was all a weird, terrifying dream. The next morning, Jacob returned to his apartment with his friend, hoping in the daylight that things would seem normal again. But as he stepped inside, he felt the air was different, colder, as though the apartment itself had been left vacant for years. And then he saw it. Written on the wall in dark, smeared letters was a single sentence, "Thank you for inviting me in." He stared, feeling a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He turned to his friend, hoping for some reassurance, but his friend's face had gone pale. "Jacob," his friend whispered, pointing to his closet door. "Look." The closet door was open, just a crack, but enough for Jacob to see a pair of dark eyes staring back at him from the shadows within. He slammed the closet door shut, and together they left the apartment, never to return. To this day, people living on the floor still hear faint, rhythmic knocking from inside the walls late at night, And some say that if you stand outside Jacob's old apartment and listen closely, you might hear a whisper from behind the door. "Let me out, Jacob. You invited me in." Megan had just moved into her new apartment, an old brick building with creaky floors and narrow hallways. Her place was on the top floor, overlooking a cityscape that looked beautiful in the daytime, but transformed into a dark maze of shadows by night. She loved the cozy, vintage feel of her apartment, but something about it felt off, like the walls were hiding secrets. On her first night, after unpacking until well past midnight, she decided to take a long shower before bed. The pipes groaned and rattled as the hot water came on, making the bathroom feel even more cramped. As she rinsed shampoo from her hair, she noticed something odd in the steam-fogged mirror. Handprints. Small, almost child-sized handprints streaked across the glass, barely visible through the haze. She brushed it off, thinking it must have been left by the previous tenant. But as she wiped the mirror clean, a prickling sensation crept over her as if someone were watching her from behind. She glanced over her shoulder at the empty bathroom. Nothing. Feeling a little shaken, she decided to ignore it, reminding herself that moving to a new place was bound to feel a little strange at first. But that night, she was awakened by a soft sound coming from somewhere in the apartment, a faint, shuffling noise like small feet padding across the floor. She lay still, listening as the sound moved closer, stopping just outside her bedroom door. Holding her breath, she waited, half expecting the door to creak open. But after a few minutes of silence, she convinced herself it was just the old building settling. She rolled over, pulling the blankets up to her chin, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next night, the noises started again, but this time they sounded louder, more deliberate. Megan tried to ignore it, putting a pillow over her head, but then she heard a soft giggle, a child's laugh, faint and echoing. Her heart pounded. She didn't have any neighbors with kids, and she was sure she'd locked the door. She sat up, switching on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. "Hello?" she called out, feeling silly for talking to an empty room. But the silence that followed was thick, heavy, as if someone or something was listening. She got out of bed, tiptoeing through the apartment, checking every door and window, but everything was locked tight. She was about to head back to bed when she noticed something strange on her kitchen floor. Flour had spilled across the tiles, forming a thin white dusting on the floor. And in that dust, she saw them, tiny footprints leading from the living room to her bedroom door. Megan's skin prickled with fear. She cleaned up the flour, trying to convince herself it was her imagination, maybe a trick of the light. But she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that she wasn't alone. On the third night, Megan stayed up late, determined to catch whatever or whoever was causing the disturbances. She left her bedroom door open, sitting in bed with her phone in hand, the flashlight app open and ready. Hours passed in silence, and just as she was about to give up and turn off the light, she heard it. A soft, dragging sound like tiny feet shuffling over the floorboards. She held her breath, heart racing, as the sound grew closer, moving down the hallway toward her bedroom. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something small, almost too light to be human. Then, just outside her doorway, the footsteps stopped. Megan waited, her pulse pounding in her ears, gripping her phone tightly. Summoning every bit of courage, she switched on the flashlight and aimed it toward the doorway. For a split second, she saw it. Something small and pale, peeking around the corner, its face obscured by long, tangled hair. But the eyes were wide, empty, staring right at her, with an expression that was both curious and terrifying. And before she could scream, the figure disappeared, melting back into the shadows. Panicking, she jumped out of bed, ran to the doorway, and aimed her flashlight down the hall. The corridor was empty, silent, as though nothing had ever been there. But as she turned to head back into her room, she noticed the same childlike handprints smeared across the walls, leading all the way to her bedroom door. She called maintenance the next morning, reporting strange noises and asking if any children lived nearby, but the worker only gave her a puzzled look. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "there haven't been kids in this building for years. Place used to be a school back in the 1920s. Shut down after a fire, killed. Well, I don't want to worry you. But no kids here now." Megan's blood ran cold. She thanked him, trying not to show her fear, and resolved to stay out that night just to give herself a break from the strangeness of her apartment. But as she came back the following evening, the door to her apartment was slightly open. She froze, her keys in her hand, staring at the crack in the door, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew she'd locked it when she left. Swallowing her fear, she stepped inside, switching on the lights. Everything looked normal until she reached her bedroom. There on her bed lay a dusty, soot-stained teddy bear that she had never seen before. Its fur was charred, the fabric scorched and crumbling, and across the walls, in childish scrawls, were the words, "Come play with me." She backed out of the room, her heart racing, and as she reached the door, she heard the faint giggle echo through the apartment once more. She didn't stop running until she was on the street below, the cold night air hitting her face as she gasped for breath. She never went back to the apartment, and though she tried to forget, every so often she'd wake up at night, convinced she could hear the faint sound of a child's laugh echoing in the dark, calling her back to play.